Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to our latest explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive topic, objectivity and neutrality, the heroes and villains of science. Now this isn't just some abstract lab stuff. This literally affects every single one of us, from the daily medications we take to the medical advice we trust with our lives. We are stepping into the incredibly high-stakes world of scientific research, and honestly, the line separating a miraculous, world-changing discovery from a devastating disaster is a whole lot thinner than you might think.
Seriously, what actually separates a life-saving medical breakthrough from a catastrophic fraud? You have to remember, when a researcher puts on a white coat and steps into a lab, they don't suddenly morph into an emotionless robot, right? They're human. They've got hopes, bills to pay, bosses to please, and their own personal beliefs. And if those human elements start leaking into their research, the results can be, well, catastrophic. So how does the scientific community protect us from this? How do we know for sure that a new drug is actually safe, or a groundbreaking medical theory is legit?
The answer comes down to two foundational pillars of scientific ethics: objectivity and neutrality. You can think of these as the ultimate shields protecting humanity from prejudice and greed. On one side, you've got objectivity. This is the internal battle. It's all about how a researcher controls their own desires and stops their personal pet hypotheses from clouding the cold, hard facts. Then, on the other side, there's neutrality. This is the external battle. It's how researchers control the environment around them, basically warding off the immense pressures of money, institutional power, and societal norms. Without both of these working in total harmony, scientific research completely stops being a tool for knowledge and just becomes a weapon for personal gain.
Which brings us to part 1, objectivity, and the absolute rule of putting evidence over desire.
By definition, objectivity is the total neutralization of a researcher's desire. But what does that actually look like? Well, it demands a full, uncompromising reliance on physical or statistical evidence. In applied research, stuff like medicine or pharmacy, you just can't build a massive conclusion on a fleeting observation or a gut feeling. It really doesn't matter if a scientist has spent 10 years desperately trying to prove a specific theory. If the data says no, their desire cannot guide the results. They have to let the evidence speak for itself, even if it completely shatters their own hypothesis.
And nothing illustrates this better than the wild story of Australian physician Dr. Barry Marshall. So, picture this. It's 1984, and the entire medical establishment is absolutely convinced that stomach ulcers are caused by stress and diet. Case closed, right? Well, Dr. Marshall had a different hypothesis. He believed a bacteria caused them. But he also knew that just arguing about it wasn't going to change the subjective consensus. He needed undeniable, objective proof. So, what did he do? He went to the extreme. This wasn't your typical Tuesday in the lab. He literally drank a beaker filled with a culture of Helicobacter pylori bacteria. Yeah, he deliberately gave himself severe gastritis. But he didn't stop there. He then had physical biopsies extracted from his own stomach just to prove the bacterial infection was physically there. By providing this irrefutable, measurable evidence, he didn't just bypass the opinions of his peers. He completely transformed global medical science, and you guessed it, won a Nobel Prize. Now, that is the raw power of pure objectivity.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our second pillar, personal neutrality and the active shedding of bias.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the historical context behind the man you're looking at. This is Friedrich Tiedemann, a 19th century German anatomist. You see, every single researcher walks into the lab carrying the cultural and historical baggage of their time. Neutrality means taking off that heavy cloak before you even look at the data. Tiedemann lived during an era heavily plagued by scientific racism, where a lot of scientists were actively looking for structural differences in human skulls just to justify slavery and inequality. But Tiedemann, he fully committed to personal neutrality. He meticulously measured human brains and skulls without letting those nasty 19th century colonial prejudices influence his tools. And his completely objective analysis led him to a groundbreaking conclusion for his time. There was absolutely no inherent difference in cranial capacity or intellectual potential between different races. Because he shed his bias, he used real science to actively advocate for human equality and the abolition of slavery. Incredible stuff.
But we have to ask, what happens when neutrality fails? Let's take a look at the darker side of science, the cost of financial bias.
It turns out money and power are probably the absolute greatest threats to scientific neutrality. When they creep in, the interpretation of results gets warped fast. Let's trace the timeline of the infamous Andrew Wakefield scandal. Back in 1998, a British physician named Andrew Wakefield published a paper in a highly prestigious medical journal claiming he found a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. But as investigations unfolded in the early 2000s, a totally horrifying reality started to emerge. It was discovered that Wakefield had engaged in blatant data fabrication and extreme cherry-picking of his data. Then, from 2004 onwards, the full scope of his hidden financial conflicts of interest finally came to light. Get this. He was secretly receiving funds from lawyers who were looking to sue vaccine companies, and he was simultaneously developing his own competing single-antigen vaccine. Naturally, the journal fully retracting the paper and Wakefield lost his medical license, but the damage, it was already done. His complete lack of neutrality triggered a global anti-vaccine movement that is literally still causing deadly childhood disease outbreaks today.
I want you to look closely at this number, 12. Wakefield's catastrophic paper, a paper that fundamentally altered the course of global public health, was based on a sample size of exactly 12 children. Just 12 kids who were carefully and selectively chosen to fit his predetermined hypothesis. He even allegedly altered the medical histories of these children in his research to falsely show that their symptoms began immediately after vaccination. It is the ultimate, tragic example of confirmation bias fueled by a massive financial conflict of interest.
And the danger isn't just with individual bad actors. It scales up. Let's examine institutional bias and tragedy.
In the late 1950s, a German pharmaceutical company introduced a drug called thalidomide. They marketed it super aggressively as a completely safe sedative, specifically targeting pregnant women to treat morning sickness. But here is where neutrality was completely thrown out the window. The pharmaceutical company funded its own research. Because they were entirely driven by institutional bias and the pursuit of profit, they deliberately ignored glaring indicators of toxicity. They selectively presented their data and completely failed to conduct adequate safety trials on fetuses. The result of that greed? Over 10,000 children worldwide were born with severe congenital deformities, like the absence or severe shortening of their limbs. It was a completely avoidable, heartbreaking tragedy born directly from the absence of neutrality toward a funder.
Yet, even in the midst of all that darkness, there was a hero who stood her ground. Dr. Frances Kelsey was a reviewer at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The pharmaceutical company, and honestly, even her own superiors, placed immense, relentless pressure on her to approve the thalidomide for the American market. But she flatly refused. She saw right through the lack of objectivity in the company's reports. She demanded sufficient neutral evidence. And by simply refusing to bow to that institutional pressure, Dr. Kelsey protected hundreds of thousands of children in America from this exact catastrophe. She is literally the personification of scientific neutrality.
So, how do we apply all of this? Let's move on to spotting real scientific facts in our own everyday lives. So, the crucial point is this. You have the power to evaluate what you read. When you see a scientific paper or a news article that boldly claims microscopic examination showed a significant improvement, you need to remember that this is just a subjective sentence. It means absolutely nothing on its own. To turn an unanchored statement like that into a credible scientific fact, you need to run it through this BS detector checklist. Does it have statistical tables? Are there graphs based on blinding, meaning the researchers didn't know which patient got which treatment, so they couldn't possibly be biased? Are there precise digital measurements? And most importantly, is there a clear, explicit declaration stating no conflict of interest? If those elements are missing, I guarantee you're likely looking at bias, not science. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. We are bombarded with information every single day, aren't we? Miraculous cures, terrifying health warnings, bold new studies popping up on our feeds. But now you know the hidden mechanics behind the curtain. You know the incredible bravery it takes to maintain real objectivity and the devastating global consequences when neutrality is sold to the highest bidder. So I leave you with this question. The next time you scroll past a bold medical headline, will you spot the science or will you spot the bias? Keep your eyes open, stay curious, and always, always look for the evidence. Thanks for joining me.